It began on an ordinary night, the kind of night you barely remember the next morning. Calm air, faint moonlight spilling across the suburban streets, and the muffled silence of sleeping neighbors. Eleanor sat curled on her couch with a thin blanket draped over her shoulders, her laptop screen glowing softly against the dim living room. She had a habit of staying up late, often scrolling through true crime forums long after she should have gone to bed. That night, the atmosphere outside seemed too still, unnaturally so, as though the neighborhood itself were holding its breath. She noticed it, of course, but dismissed the unease as nerves stirred up by the grim stories she'd been reading. The first knock came at 12:47 a.m. It was faint, deliberate, 3 steady taps against the front door. Eleanor froze, her heart skipping a beat. She lived alone, in a small townhouse at the end of the cul-de-sac, and unexpected visitors at that hour were unheard of. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. Maybe it was a branch brushing against the siding, or a neighbor who'd gotten the wrong house. But the knocks came again, this time sharper, more insistent. She turned down the volume on her laptop, the silence afterward so heavy that she could hear her own breathing. Gathering her courage, Eleanor tiptoed to the peephole. The hallway light above the front porch flickered faintly, but she could make out a figure standing there. A tall, thin silhouette, unmoving, head slightly tilted as if listening for her presence inside. The figure wore something dark, maybe a hoodie or coat, but she couldn't see the face. A rush of cold terror swept over her. Every instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, but the strange part was that the figure didn't knock again. They just stood there, patient, waiting. Minutes dragged on. Eleanor stayed glued to the peephole, her breath fogging the glass. She thought about calling the police, but what would she even report? Someone standing on her porch? She backed away slowly, careful not to make noise, and retreated to the living room. When she glanced out the side window, she saw nothing, just the empty street, still lit by the pale moonlight. The figure seemed to have vanished, though she hadn't heard any footsteps leaving. She sat back on the couch, trying to steady herself, convincing her mind it had been a trick of the light or her imagination. Yet, deep down, she knew better. At 2:03 a.m., the sound came again, but not from the front door. This time, it was from the back, a subtle tapping against the sliding glass door that opened to her yard. Eleanor's stomach sank as she realized the figure hadn't left at all. They had moved around the house. Trembling, she turned off her laptop screen, plunging the room into darkness. The tapping grew slower, almost playful now, as if whoever was outside knew she was listening. She stayed frozen in the dark, gripping the blanket tightly, until at last the tapping stopped. But Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She sat awake until dawn, staring at the glass door, knowing this was only the beginning. The next evening, Eleanor tried to dismiss what had happened as an overactive imagination. She told herself it must have been a drunk neighbor, or maybe a teenager playing some cruel prank. But as dusk fell, a quiet dread began to creep over her. She kept glancing at the windows, double-checking the locks, and making sure the curtains were drawn tight. When she poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembled enough that she nearly dropped it. The night before had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, and she couldn't shake the image of the figure's silhouette lingering at her door. It'd be 11 p.m. Eleanor decided she wouldn't sit in silence again. She left a lamp on in each room and pulled out her phone, ready to call the police if anything strange happened. She even went as far as sliding a kitchen knife into her pocket, ridiculous as it felt. She tried to distract herself with television, turning up the volume higher than usual, but she found herself pausing every few minutes to listen to the house. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though someone, or something, was waiting for her to let her guard down. At 12:19 a.m., her dog, an old, sleepy beagle named Jasper, lifted his head from his bed and growled low in his throat. Eleanor froze. Jasper rarely made a sound, and when he did, it was never without reason. His ears perked up, his body rigid, staring toward the back of the house. Eleanor muted the TV, and that's when she heard it. The soft crunch of footsteps on dead leaves, slow and deliberate, circling her yard. The sound moved from one side of the house to the other, scraping through the silence, until it stopped just below her bedroom window. Gathering courage, she crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. Her breath caught. Out in the yard, beneath the shadow of the maple tree, the same tall figure stood, facing her house. This time, she could see more detail. A long, dark coat hanging loosely on their frame, their head tilted at that same unnatural angle. What unsettled her most wasn't just that they were staring. It was the fact that their face was obscured, as though shadow itself clung to their features, refusing to let her see who, or what, they were. Eleanor stumbled back, nearly tripping over Jasper. She grabbed her phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The operator answered, calm and steady, but when Eleanor explained that someone was in her yard, watching her, the woman's tone shifted. Stay inside. Do not confront them. Officers are on their way. Eleanor clutched the phone tightly, praying help would arrive quickly. Yet, even as the minutes stretched on, the figure never moved, never flinched. They simply stood there, waiting. And when the distant wail of sirens finally filled the air, the yard was empty once again. 2 officers arrived that night, their cruiser's lights casting a rotating wash of red and blue across Eleanor's walls. She ushered them quickly inside, desperate for reassurance, but the men were calm, almost indifferent. They swept through the house, shined their flashlights across the yard, and found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of forced entry. One officer, a stocky man with a tired expression, suggested it was probably a prowler spooked by the sound of approaching sirens. Eleanor wanted to believe him, but the way the figure had lingered, motionless, patient, didn't feel like the work of someone easily frightened. When Eleanor tried to describe the face, or rather the lack of one, the officers exchanged a glance that made her uneasy. They asked if she'd been drinking, or if she had a history of sleep problems. She felt her cheeks burn with anger, but she bit her tongue. In the end, they offered to file a report, though their words carried the unspoken message: this is nothing serious. As they left, one officer suggested she install motion sensor lights, or maybe even a security camera, though his tone carried more dismissal than concern. By 3 a.m., the street was quiet again, and Eleanor was alone. Sleep was out of the question, so she sat at the kitchen table, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. Her hands trembled against the mug of coffee she had made, though she hadn't touched it. She thought about the way the figure had tilted its head, the deliberate tapping on the glass, and how it seemed more like communication than an attempted entry. The memory sent a chill down her spine. Whoever, or whatever, it was, it hadn't come to break in. It had come to be seen. The following morning, she tried to convince herself she'd overreacted. Sunlight poured into the house, warm and ordinary, making the terror of the night before feel like a half-remembered dream. She went about her routine, forcing normalcy onto her life, feeding Jasper, tidying up, even heading to the grocery store. But while she stood in line at the checkout, she caught herself glancing at every tall man who passed by, searching their faces for something familiar, some clue. It was irrational, she knew, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure might be following her even in daylight. That night, she tried something different. She left every light on inside the house and sat in the living room with the blinds open, staring out at the yard as if daring the figure to return. Hours passed in silence. Just as her eyelids began to droop, Jasper's growl broke the stillness again. Eleanor's eyes shot to the window, and her heart stopped. There he was, the figure, standing in the same spot beneath the maple tree. Only this time, there was something new. In one pale hand, the figure held what looked like a folded piece of paper. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted it and pressed it flat against his chest, as though offering it to her. Eleanor couldn't move. She sat rigid on the couch, eyes locked on the figure outside, the paper clutched against its chest. The yard light flickered weakly, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch toward her windows. The figure didn't shift, didn't breathe, just stood there with that silent offering. Eleanor's instincts screamed at her to hide, to close the blinds and pretend she hadn't seen it, but something stronger compelled her to watch. It was as though the figure wanted her attention, and now that she had it, she felt trapped in a silent dialogue she hadn't agreed to. Minutes dragged by. Jasper whined softly, pacing near the sliding glass door. Then, without warning, the figure moved. Slowly, methodically, it lowered the paper to the ground, placing it carefully at the base of the tree. Eleanor's pulse quickened. After leaving the paper, the figure turned, not toward the street, but toward the woods behind the row of houses. Without haste, it melted into the darkness, swallowed whole by the trees as though it had always belonged there. Eleanor remained frozen long after it had disappeared, every nerve in her body straining at the thought of retrieving the paper at dawn. When the sunlight finally gave her courage, Eleanor slipped outside. Her hands shook as she crossed the yard, Jasper glued to her side, hackles raised. The paper lay exactly where the figure had placed it, a neat square of white against the grass. She picked it up, her heart hammering. The sheet was folded twice, crisp and deliberate. For a moment, she considered tossing it straight into the trash without looking, but the weight of her own curiosity pressed too hard against her chest. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. The paper was nearly blank, except for a single line written in black ink, the letters uneven as though scrawled in haste. "I see you too." Eleanor's stomach lurched. She stood in the yard, the morning sun warming her skin, yet she felt colder than she had in the middle of the night. The words blurred in her vision as panic surged through her. Whoever this figure was, they weren't just haunting her home. They wanted her to know she was being watched, seen, and acknowledged. She bolted back inside, locking every door and window she passed. Clutching the note to her chest, she sat at the kitchen table, trembling. The police wouldn't believe her, not after the way they had dismissed her before. Even if she showed them the note, it could easily be dismissed as a prank. But deep down, Eleanor knew it was more than that. This wasn't random. This was intentional. And as she stared at the words over and over again, a horrifying thought took root. The figure had been watching her long before she'd ever noticed. Eleanor left the note on the kitchen counter, though she couldn't stop herself from glancing at it every few minutes. The words seemed to follow her, no matter which room she walked into. She tried distracting herself with chores, opening windows for fresh air, even playing music to drown out the silence. But her mind circled back to the same terrifying thought. How long had the figure been watching her? That question hollowed her out more than the sight of the figure itself. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion set in. She hadn't slept properly in 2 nights, and her body begged for rest. Curling up on the couch, she drifted in and out of uneasy dreams. When she woke an hour later, her first instinct was to check the counter. The note was still there, but it wasn't folded the way she had left it. It lay open now, the words facing upward, as though someone had carefully smoothed it out while she slept. Eleanor's throat tightened. She locked every door before lying down. She knew she had. Panic surged through her veins. She tore through the house, checking closets, the basement, even under the bed. Jasper barked furiously at the hallway, but when she flicked the light on, there was nothing there. Still, the sense of presence lingered, pressing against her chest, heavy and suffocating. She dialed the police again, but when the dispatcher asked if she had actually seen anyone, Eleanor faltered. The line went quiet for a long moment before the voice offered a polite but perfunctory promise to send a car when possible. Desperate, she called her sister, Hannah, who lived 2 towns over. Eleanor poured everything out in a trembling rush. The knocks, the figure, the note. Hannah listened, though her silence on the other end was heavy. Finally, she said, "Ellie, you're scaring yourself into paranoia. You need sleep. Maybe even a break from that house." Eleanor wanted to argue, but her sister's tone was steady, firm, and drenched in the kind of rationality Eleanor could no longer hold on to. Still, when they hung up, the silence in the house returned, thicker than before. That night, Eleanor set up her phone on a makeshift tripod, propping it against a stack of books with the camera pointed at the living room and sliding glass door. If she was going to prove she wasn't losing her mind, she needed evidence. She pressed record, turned off the lights, and sat quietly in the kitchen, listening. Hours passed in suffocating silence. Just as her eyelids began to droop, Jasper's growl tore through the dark again. Eleanor's heart raced as she realized, if something happened this time, the camera would catch it. The night dragged on in suffocating silence. Amelia sat curled in the corner of the living room, knife clutched tight in her trembling hand, eyes fixed on the door. Hours seemed to pass without movement, until fatigue began to blur her fear. Just as her head dipped, the sound came again, a faint, sickening creak. Not from the porch this time, but from the hinges themselves. Her stomach dropped as she watched the front door tremble, then ease open, inch by inch, Though the deadbolt had never been turned, the air changed immediately. A heavy dampness poured into the room, carrying the smell of wet soil and something older, sour, like decay buried deep beneath the ground. The lamps flickered, their light shrinking into small, struggling pools as though the darkness was swallowing them whole. Amelia pressed herself deeper into the corner, knife raised uselessly, as the tall figure stepped across the threshold. Its form was wrong, too long, too narrow, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as though joints had been misplaced. The figure didn't rush her. It didn't need to. Instead, it paused in the center of the living room, tilting its head as if listening. The dim light caught just enough to suggest the outline of a face, but where features should have been there was only smoothness, shifting faintly, like mist caught behind glass. Its presence filled the room with a crushing weight, as if the house itself was straining under the burden of hosting it. The knife in Amelia's hand felt like a child's toy against something that should not exist. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body betrayed her. Her legs locked, her throat closed, as though the thing's very nearness had stolen control from her. The figure moved then, slow and deliberate, turning its faceless head toward the staircase. For a terrifying moment, she thought it had lost interest in her, that it would simply drift upstairs. But then it stopped, cocked its head again, and released a sound, a low, guttural whisper. It spoke her name, Amelia. Her paralysis shattered into raw panic. She scrambled toward the kitchen, slipping on broken glass as she ran. The thing didn't follow immediately, but its whisper carried through the rooms, brushing against her ears no matter where she moved. She yanked open the back door, praying it wasn't sealed like the front. The handle turned easily, but as she pulled it open, cold air rushed in, and standing just beyond the threshold was another figure. Identical. Waiting. The footage looped in Eleanor's head like a nightmare on repeat. She couldn't bring herself to delete it, but she also couldn't watch it again without feeling the urge to vomit. That morning, she drove straight to a hardware store, her hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire way. She filled her cart with motion sensor lights, extra locks, and a cheap set of home security cameras. The cashier made a joke about her preparing for the apocalypse, but Eleanor didn't even force a smile. She just wanted to get home, install everything, and prove to herself she still had some control left by afternoon. She had cameras covering every entry point, wires trailing awkwardly across her floors. Jasper followed her nervously from room to room, whining whenever she paused too long by the glass door. When everything was set, Eleanor sat down and called the police again, this time insisting they send someone in person. She played them the footage directly on her phone. The officer leaned in, brows furrowed, but when the video showed the sliding door opening, his expression hardened. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this could be doctored. People fake this kind of thing all the time." Eleanor's protests only seemed to make him more skeptical. Frustrated, she turned next to her neighbors. The couple 2 doors down listened politely, but exchanged uneasy glances when she mentioned the faceless figure. "We haven't seen anything unusual," the husband said, his tone tight, final. Another neighbor, a young mother, nodded sympathetically but added, "Maybe it's just stress. Nights can play tricks on you." Eleanor felt her chest tighten with humiliation and anger. Every word she spoke made her sound more unhinged. By the time she returned home, her paranoia had doubled. If no one else believed her, then she was completely alone in this. That night, she sat awake again, glued to the live feed of her new cameras. Hours dragged by with nothing but static and the occasional flicker of movement from Jasper pacing. Finally, at 2:12 a.m., one of the cameras buzzed faintly, the feed glitching for just a second. Eleanor leaned closer to the screen. The living room camera steadied, and she saw it. The figure, standing not outside, but inside the house, in the very center of the room. The image flickered again, and when it cleared, the figure was gone. No sound, no movement, just the faint hum of the electronics. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps as she replayed the clip. It lasted less than 3 seconds, but it was enough. The figure hadn't used the door this time. It had simply appeared. She sat frozen at the kitchen table, clutching Jasper close, the realization striking her like a physical blow. Locks, lights, cameras, it didn't matter. None of it mattered. The figure wasn't just an intruder. It was something else, something that didn't belong in her world but had found its way in. And now, it wasn't leaving.
Eleanor barely slept after seeing the figure on her security feed. By morning, her nerves were frayed raw, her eyes sunken, her hands trembling with exhaustion. She replayed the clip again and again, each time convincing herself it had to be some kind of glitch, until she remembered the night vision video from her phone. 2 devices, 2 recordings, too much to explain away. Still, doubt clawed at her mind. If no one else could see what she saw, then how long before even she stopped believing her own senses? She left every light in the house on again that night, the hum of electricity a thin comfort against the gnawing silence. Jasper refused to leave her side, his body tense and restless. Midnight came and went. For a while, nothing happened. Then, at 1:37 a.m., the air shifted. Eleanor felt it before she heard it. A pressure, thick and heavy, settling across the house like a storm cloud. She sat rigid in her chair, heart pounding. And then came the sound, a faint, drawn-out whisper curling through the silence. It was inside the house. She couldn't make out the words at first, only the rhythm of them. Low, hushed, almost like someone speaking just on the other side of a wall. Jasper growled, staring at the hallway, his fur bristling. Eleanor grabbed the knife she kept on the counter, gripping it so tightly her knuckles went white. "Who's there?" she whispered back, her voice breaking. The house answered with silence, then another long hiss of whispering, closer this time, just behind her. She spun around, but the kitchen was empty. The lights flickered once, humming angrily before steadying again. The whispering stopped, but the weight of it lingered, pressing against her ears, her skull. Trembling, she bolted to the living room camera feed, her eyes searching for movement. The figure wasn't outside, nor was it in the room. But as she leaned closer to the screen, the audio playback caught it. Faint, distorted, threading through the static. Her own name. Drawn out. Repeated. Eleanor. Her blood ran cold. She slammed the laptop shut and staggered back, Jasper barking furiously into the emptiness. For the first time since this began, Eleanor realized she might not just be dealing with a stalker or a trespasser. This wasn't simply a presence watching her. It was a presence seeking her, and it knew her name. By the 9th night, Eleanor was unraveling. Her once tidy townhouse had become a mess of coffee cups, tangled wires, and notebooks filled with frantic scribbles of times, dates, and descriptions of every noise she had heard. Sleep was nearly impossible, and when it did come, it was shallow and full of half-dreams. The whispers had not returned since that night, but their absence was worse. Silence was no comfort now. Silence meant waiting to 8:11 a.m. Jasper stirred from his spot at her feet and let out a sharp, terrified bark. Eleanor's eyes darted to the living room camera feed. At first, the image showed nothing unusual, just the familiar, still scene of her couch and sliding glass door. But then, the air seemed to bend. The shadows warped, stretching long across the floor, and the figure emerged from the distortion itself, as though peeling out of the wall. Eleanor's stomach dropped. It wasn't using doors anymore. The figure stood taller than she remembered, its head still cocked unnaturally to the side. Its faceless visage seemed to shimmer faintly, as though a blur in reality itself. Eleanor clutched the knife in her hand, though she knew it would be useless. Jasper's barking escalated into a frenzy, but the figure didn't react. It simply turned, slowly, deliberately, toward the camera. And then, for the first time, it moved its hand. Long, spindly fingers reached forward, curling toward the lens, and the feed cut to static. The house went dark. Every light, every hum of electricity, gone in an instant. Eleanor's scream caught in her throat as she stumbled backward, clutching Jasper. The silence was suffocating, total. Then came the sound. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, echoing against the floorboards. They weren't coming from outside. They were moving through her hallway. Closer. Closer still. Her body shook with terror as she pressed herself against the kitchen wall, knife trembling in her hand, praying she would wake up. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen doorway. Eleanor's breath hitched, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. The darkness seemed to pulse, thick and alive. And then, slowly, impossibly, the figure stepped into the faint moonlight spilling through the kitchen window. Its form was distorted, edges bending like heat waves, its faceless head tilting downward toward her. For the first time, Eleanor felt its attention not as a distant gaze, but as a crushing weight pressing directly into her mind. And she realized the truth. The figure hadn't come to be seen. It had come to claim her.
The figure's presence in the kitchen froze Eleanor in place. She couldn't scream, couldn't move, only cling tighter to Jasper as he barked and snarled at the shifting silhouette. The faceless head tilted slowly from side to side, studying her like prey pinned beneath a predator. Eleanor's knife trembled in her grip, though deep down she knew. Just as she had known when she watched the footage, the blade meant nothing here. Still, she forced herself to stand. Her voice cracked as she shouted, "Get out!" The words felt empty in the heavy silence. The figure stepped closer, each movement bending the air as though reality strained to contain it. Eleanor stumbled backward into the counter, the knife slipping from her hand and clattering against the tile. The sound echoed far too loudly, filling the room like a gunshot. Jasper lunged forward, teeth bared, but the figure simply turned its faceless head toward him. In an instant, the dog fell silent, whimpering as he collapsed to the floor, trembling but alive. Eleanor's chest tightened. It hadn't even touched him. Its mere focus had drained his will. She bolted. Adrenaline surged through her as she sprinted toward the front door, fumbling at the locks with shaking hands. Behind her, the air thickened, pulsing like a heartbeat, but she refused to turn around. The deadbolt finally gave way, and she flung the door open, rushing out into the cold night air. She didn't stop to grab shoes or a coat. She ran barefoot into the street, pounding on the nearest neighbor's door, screaming for help until her voice broke. Lights flicked on inside, but as she turned back toward her own house, her stomach sank. Every window of her home glowed with an unnatural light, pale and blinding, as if the figure had ignited the house from within. Its silhouette stretched tall across the curtains, moving slowly from room to room, claiming each space like it belonged there. Eleanor's neighbors emerged, confused and alarmed, but when she begged them to look, really look, their faces paled. "There's nothing there," one whispered, backing away. She realized then what the figure had already known. It was hers alone to see. Hers alone to fear. By the time the police arrived, Eleanor was gone. Jasper was found trembling in the yard, but inside the house, there was no sign of struggle, no trace of forced entry. Only the faint hum of static lingering in every room, like the echo of something that had passed through. On the kitchen counter lay a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half. When the officer opened it, he frowned, confused by the uneven letters scrawled across the page. It read, "I see you now.